My name is Tim Carter. This is a lesson for Cornell University. Cornell University is an extension of our IamCornell.org apologetic and outreach ministry of Landmark Missionary Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Arkansas. We faithfully and for the full intended purpose of assembling, do so faithfully at 2200 Marshall Road. The topic today, especially through all the cultural identities that people appropriate for themselves. I remember years ago a phrase or a term called yuppie, young urban professional, and I had taken that as an acronym and expanded it to yuppie, a young united person praying in earnest, and I started a Sunday school class called the Yuppies, and I wanted to take that acronym and give it meaning that had some eternal implication, not some sociological or some fad in culture. Boomers, Gen Xers, or Generation X. I don't know if a hippie was a social identity. I don't know if it was a compliment or I don't know. I wasn't allowed to be one. My father decided what I would be. And then millennial, that's another cultural identity people appropriate. And then politically, people have identities, independent, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, although none of those items actually exist in our Constitution. And they're certainly not expressions of political science. And recently I heard of a book entitled Why Religion and Politics Drive People Crazy? And I was laughing about it and speaking to someone about it, and they said, "What is it?" I said, "Well, you'll never find a book entitled Why Political Science and Hermeneutics Drive People Crazy, because they don't. People don't care to be involved in that which requires a cognitive engagement, mental thought. So when people prefer the chaos of what they call politics, which can be whatever you want it to be. You could express several values today, and no one would know which political party that they should attribute that to. For example, there's people who say they're socially liberal and fiscally conservative. That's confusing, or they are socially liberal. Well, I don't know what they say. But anyway, long story short is that can be anything you want. So if you're religious, you can make it up as you go along. It has no direct correlation to any type of text. As I like to ask people, what denomination are the words in the Bible? So since people don't know the words in the Bible, that's why we teach and make disciples according to the text and give meanings and rationale. But when a catastrophe occurs or tragedy occurs, let's say someone forgets that their cultural identity is just between their ears, it's not something that should arouse hatred from others, and then we see people resort to violence. Well, they're just looking for a name. So whether it's a cultural identity they appropriate for themselves or a religious identity, a political identity, all those are just necessary, I guess, for people to then go out and accomplish what was already in their hearts. So recently I had noticed online the article about the 9-year-old boy in Denver, Colorado that took his life because it says the headline was homophobic bullying at school. First of all, he's 9 years old. Was no more. His life's over. He was bullied, but what was it about sexual identity that children that young would be so aware of as to know how to pressure, bully, persecute another person? Which, interesting, what if 3 years from now he no longer identified anyway as that? So it called for another one of those. People have set up another false dichotomy of heterosexual or homosexual. And of course, when people appropriate this, they suppose that you have to choose from the options that are presented. And, they don't know this, but if you read in the Bible where it says homosexual act, a homosexual act, like for example in Leviticus, it says that's an abomination. But if you also read all the long, lengthy list in Leviticus 18, the great majority of those are heterosexual actions, and it says that those are abominations. So everything listed, including a male with a male, is all described as abominations, plural. So the Bible does not teach that we should identify ourselves as heterosexual, nor that we should identify ourselves as homosexual. And if that's something that's intrigued you for the moment, I would like to suspend your imagination for just a few more moments, because it's always a little bit of a dissonance for someone. They have to deal with their cognitive dissonance, or they have to stop and think, wait a minute, what am I being told right now? How am I supposed to respond? So you're choosing to freeze, to fight, or to flee. And you're not even aware that your experiences between your ears are stored somewhere in your brain called a hippocampus. And you're looking in there at your hippocampus and saying, hey, this man's doing a video. He says that the Bible condemns both heterosexuality and homosexuality. And I'm trying to figure out, because my neocortex is trying to talk to me, but I can't listen to that because I'm too busy over here in my hippocampus reacting, because my amygdala is saying, here's some adrenaline to go with this occasion through the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So let's get some adrenaline going, and let's see what we can do and react in this video to this guy who's telling me something I may have never heard before. Well, let's look at the meanings of words as the historical holistic hermeneutic by Dr. John Penn of the Missionary Baptist Seminary would say. First, let's define our terms. Well, invented identities, it says in the second half of the 19th century, sexologists, whatever that is, invented the idea of heterosexual. Observations were made that males and females do not represent two discrete populations, such as heterosexual and homosexual. Now, that was the second half of the 19th century. It goes on here, some information that anyone can ascertain. It says the term heterosexual was used in the United States by Dr. James G. Kerman, Kierman, in 1892. And that term heterosexual was linked to abnormal manifestations of the sexual appetite. And this included desire for both sexes. Well, if you read Leviticus 18, it appears, and since it was written not to homosexuals and not to heterosexuals, it was written to men in that old covenant. And there's a list so long of objects that they were disallowed to engage that it's quite disturbing. But we don't see in the text where the writer of the text, and let's say dear Moses, didn't stop and say, okay, now when I call your name, or when I call out your identity, you guys come over and I'll tell you which law applies to you. So those of you that identify yourselves with reference to bestiality, you come over and I'll tell you what the Bible says about that. Those of you that identify yourselves as heterosexuals, you come over here and I'll talk to you about that. Oh, and those of you that identify yourselves as homosexuals, I'll talk to you about that. Now, the Bible doesn't teach that. It says that all of those were spoken to the same people on the same terms, and all of them, it was called upon and found necessary for all of them, all those males in particular there, to be told this. And then it says that this same Dr. James G. Kerman in 1892 spoke of homosexual, but equally he did about heterosexual. So it was an invented identity, somewhat like millennial, Gen X, boomer, yuppie, whatever people want to do. But it's become so severe, apparently, that I even read an article where a pastor writing stopped in the middle of his blog, I suppose, and wrote, "Full disclosure, I'm a heterosexual Christian," as if somehow he was afraid to not make it clear that I'm heterosexual. And then a very astute professor, president of a seminary, Dr. Al Mohler, it's on record, he said his orientation wasn't sinful. So I don't know, but depravity of the total man would probably disagree with that. So the Bible seemed to list a lot of things in Leviticus 18 that would be considered opposite of Al Mohler, a male, but it would not, by being opposite, not cause that object to not be sinful for him to act in accordance to that. I read the list sometimes. I always thought about reading on here, but I thought, my goodness, it's so graphic, it's so appalling to think, who are these people that this would have to be told? Well, that's why the law stops our mouths. So we have now invented identities. We found the word origins. We found that often, and I've heard it oftentimes, where people would say, well, you know, homosexuality was once listed as abnormal behavior. Well, because of bias, cognitive and affective, we have inaction source bias, where we don't want to look at what might speak of us. But, you know, heterosexual is listed as abnormal, and abnormal manifestations of the sexual appetite, which include a desire for both sexes. So how does that help anything? Well, let's stop for a minute and just think about it. When I was a child, I wasn't born until 1962, so something happened in the 60s and 70s, and it was called a sexual revolution. Well, that's really not true. It's an incomplete expression. It was a heterosexual revolution. And they demanded, these males and females alike, demanded free love. They have since litigated and won in courts of law and through legislative actions the freedom to divorce on demand, to remarry whomever, whenever, for whatever reason they want to marry, anytime and as often as they want. So serial monogamy, I guess, is a phrase for it. And they don't allow people to exclude them from anything, even churches in the United States. It would be hard-pressed to find a congregation somewhere that would be known for having banned people who've ever been married before, or who had gone through a divorce before, or who had been divorced, or who had divorced someone. It's not even adjudicated in churches in this culture, to my knowledge. I hope some of you can give me feedback and say, oh, I was in a church where a couple were having problems and considering divorce, but they came to the church and sat down, and it was handled very discreetly, and then it required some more people to sit with them and to go through this, and then finally it came before the whole church body, and everyone sat and talked and shared with them and encouraged them to stay together and save their marriage. Maybe you know of that. I don't know. I know usually I don't find out about that. But I know in Arkansas, when the law passed that legalized or gave the right, and it was won by males and females alike, to have a license to be married or recognized as married by the state of Arkansas, even if you were the same sex, the social media was bombarded. Talk about how horrible it was and how terrible this is. But no one had social media during the heterosexual revolution, when the same males and females demanded the right to divorce on demand, to remarry as often as they like. Well, you may know someone that's been married 4 or 5 times, or you may know a couple who are married who between them might share half a dozen marriages. So that may not even be abnormal. So whatever's happened to marriage, the males and females that are advocating new laws still today to even include same-sex is just an extension of the sexual revolution, which unqualified, you might not notice that was a heterosexual revolution. And scandals in our political world, and now scandals again in the religious world, as large as global, all over the world, a religion that refuses their leadership to be married now have this scandal with them, and there's no necessary correlation there. I was just saying how ironic it is that all this centricity around the latest thing, same sex and marriage, something's been lost. So what does the Bible teach if it doesn't teach heterosexuality, if it doesn't teach homosexuality? What does it teach? Well, I have a few verses: Acts 15:20, 1 Corinthians 5:1, 1 Corinthians 6:13, 6:18, 10:8, 2 Corinthians 12:21, Galatians 5:19, Ephesians 5:3, Colossians 3:5. You won't remember all that, but just look it up. But it talks about abstinence. And if a person is unable to remain abstinent, then marriage. Now, several years ago, almost 2 decades now, I was working in a local school district with an abstinent program. And it was so different because so many people have just given up. It's like, it's not realistic. You're really just, upsetting people. But when a 9-year-old in Colorado, according to the August 28, 2018 news that came across the online internet, I suppose, will be so distressed and distraught because he outs himself as one identity, a category called homosexuality, and then be so bombarded by pressure and ridicule by people who apparently think they're heterosexual. But 9-year-olds are really nomosexual. There's no sexuality in play. There's certainly no actions. And I know I speak from a very, I would say, sheltered perspective because boys and girls are separated. We have boys classes, girl classes. Youth camps will have boys on one side, girls on the. So I come from a boy and girl world that is demographically, geographically, and logistically demarcated, so that interaction with girls at certain ages, really the opportunity doesn't even occur. And then, of course, in school, I don't know what the schools are like around here. I do know recently, maybe last year, unfortunately, I heard of someone who killed himself because he was ridiculed for identifying as homosexual. But I don't understand how that speaks well of those who choose to identify themselves as heterosexual if they're going to be so vicious as to cause someone to kill themselves. It just seems to be another stain on the bogus identity of heterosexuality. The Bible doesn't have anything like that. And marriage in the Bible is between a male and a female who, according to the Bible, it says that the man will have no authority over his own body in marriage. The New Testament kind of marriage, I'll qualify that. The woman will have no authority over her body in a New Testament marriage. And today, that is not culturally known. Women advocate the right to demand abortion as heterosexual females, their identity. They demand the right to abort their own unborn children, and they say they have the authority to do that. Well, in a New Testament, New Covenant marriage, the man gives up authority over his body. He loves the wife sacrificially as Christ loved the church, so he gives his life for her. Now, they intentionally enter into this covenant inside the context of a New Covenant church for the purpose of reflecting the relationship of Christ and that body there in that particular area where they hold their membership and where they're united. It says the woman deliberately submits herself to the husband, demonstrably so much so that people can observe it. Children are to obey their parents, the father who takes on this responsibility of creating a child with this female. Neither one of them have identities. Now they're husband and wife. They're male and female, husband and wife, father and mother. And God is the head of Jesus. Jesus the head of the husband's head of the wife, and the children obey the parents. And that occurs in the context of a New Testament church. And people say, what's the big deal about church? Well, I guess the glory of God, the future of humanity, the sake of children who don't want to be in homes where the male identifies himself according to his sexuality and not his responsibility. A man can say he's heterosexual, which means he has not said anything to imply that he would give up his life for a woman, much more a woman who's his wife. For a woman to say she's heterosexual would say nothing about her responsibility to submit herself to her own husband as the church submits herself to Christ. It'd be hard to find a church where people are even boasting or proud or even somewhat humble about the fact that their church obeys Christ and submits to Christ. So much so that young ladies in their church can grow up and be told by a pastor in a wedding service, now, young lady, you submit yourself to your husband like the church of which you're a body member. You've seen time and time again in a demonstrable manner submit herself as the church, as the body of Christ, as his wife, to Christ, her head, her husband, who's laid down his life for her. Well, that's a beautiful romantic love story, but sexual identity has nothing to do with responsibility. So heterosexuals have no interest in marriage according to the New Testament marriage. Homosexuals have no interest in New Testament marriage. So why they argue with each other is just to sustain the social catalyst according to which each can find themselves politically maneuvered in a way that serves their own interest, which is fine. That's a culture we're in. We're here to call people to come out. But in this marriage argument today, I know personally, just speaking of my experience, the doctrine in the Bible is totally lost. You just don't run across people who admire you because you're a husband. I've even had people ask me, when a pastor now, leaves his wife, divorces her, forget who's responsible, because like I said, that's not carried out in a church. Even though the Bible says that we will judge matters concerning even the angels themselves, why would we not be judging marriages of the most top priority in a church, which is composed of families, which are heads of households, fathers to their children, mothers to their children, husbands to their wives, wives to their husbands, and children obeying their parents deliberately in a demonstrable way. So what's lost is what the Bible teaches about abstinence. So there is no such thing. What's the need of a sexual identity? You know, I've heard people argue about reproductive rights, but it begs the question, what's the reproductive need in a culture like ours? I would think that would need to be qualified. But before it's lost altogether, why would someone need a sexual identity if there is no sexual actions? And then in marriage, if what comes with it, even Jesus' apostles said, well, Lord, if that's what marriage is, what profit is it for us to get married? Because their culture taught them, like all relationships in cultures, you exploit the person. So you see them as a means to another end. You don't see the marriage as the end in itself, because then being married on purpose, being married with purpose, being two people who love God and are called according to his purpose, that includes the marriage. And that's why it speaks of in the church letters, let's say Ephesians, for example, it speaks of the man being the head of the wife and him loving his wife like Christ loved the church and him loving her like he loves himself. Well, these terms and these doctrines and these teachings are lost in the midst of a cultural environment, especially if a pastor will say he's a heterosexual Christian, and if a scholar like Al Mohler will say, well, his orientation isn't sinful. There's no orientation outside of marriage. A person's actually oriented in marriage. You learn to be a father. You learn to be a husband in marriage. You are taught from a home where you saw your father give his life for your mother. You learn in the church where you see the church submit herself to Christ, demonstrably so. So yes, heterosexuals oppose marriage. Homosexuals people who identify, males and females who identify themselves sexually, contradict marriage. And if you read the statistics on, let's say, porn addiction, just by people who identify themselves as pastors, they seek therapy, they struggle with it. People just throw their hands up and say, well, that's just the way it is for everybody. Well, there's just a problem with that. Marriage was prescribed in the Bible so that that would not be the case. And in a person's walk with Christ and following Jesus, if in the greater part of that is not in the demonstration of a man loving a woman enough to do that sacrificially, to give up his life for her, and for her to deliberately, intentionally, on purpose, purposely submit herself to her husband in honor of Christ, the head of her husband, in honor of God the Father, the head of Jesus, and in honor of her husband's willingness to love sacrificially and her love submissively. And then the children then see that type of obedience and then honor and obey their parents. And then that's done in a church, a church there, an actual body in the location of where they live and where they conduct their lives. No wonder people call it a struggle. Why don't these pastors just out themselves as heterosexuals? Why don't they just admit that they are living according to a sexual identity and not according to a biblical responsibility? If giving up, quote, sex outside of marriage is the first step in before you marry someone, then it seems to be a complete contradiction. So by devaluing the Lord's churches, strategically localized all over the world, which they're totally devalued, people have no respect for the Lord's church. We've had people come here, low IQ, low EQ, emotional quotient, low CI, no cultural intelligence whatsoever, stagger in here like some guy that's not quite over his hangover from some silly bar down the street. And he comes in here and he wants to see if we can entertain him. He wants to know if he's going to like the sermon. How would he know if I preached a good sermon? He doesn't know the Bible. He has a sexual identity but no responsibility. He has no interest in being a father. He's not admired for being a husband. I can tell you just from being out in the real world, I never found a lot of people who admired me for being married to the only person I ever dated. I never found too many people admiring me for, now you running on, I'm going home now to be with my family, to be a father to my sons and raise them upwardly in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. That's just not supported and encouraged out there. Pastors are pressured to be promiscuous, I suppose, or to identify sexually. I'm not certain, but something's being lost here. And I think Al Mohler is smart enough to just tell people appropriating an identity is definitely not the same as taking on the responsibility. And if living for Christ is the greater part is not as the husband of a wife, as the father to a child, as a brother in the new covenant, in a new covenant church, if it's not upholding the truth of the gospel, the correct message, if it's not holding fast your profession of faith conferred in baptism, if it's not following and fellowshipping into that gospel, which we call commemorate in communion services, as that body there, covenanted together, and if it's not the responsibility of the Great Commission to teach others to obey the teachings of Jesus while we ourselves are doing so, then I'm not sure I understand Christianity, nor would I want to be part of it if all it does is make me look like the culture, which I'm told not to be fashioned according to it, but to be transformed through the renovation of my mind. And the first indication of a renovated mind is I don't appropriate sexual identities. What does that mean? And I even was heard once saying, well, I'm not a heterosexual, I'm married. And the person that heard me say it is supposedly a Christian and said, what do you mean you're not a heterosexual? I said, I'm married. And I actually had more than one person who identified himself as gay, his sexual identity, say that that's why he had left his wife and children. But I don't know why a man identifying himself in any way, according to any category of sexual identity, would use that to justify leaving his wife and children, especially if he fathered the children, especially if he betrothed and married the wife, especially if he's the one that brought these children into existence, especially if he claims to be a believer, especially. Well, what is it about a person's sexual identity that will determine if they're responsible as a husband or a wife, or as a mother or a father. There's no such thing in the Bible. So the Bible is very clear. When we make disciples, we are training people to make a commitment, even a commitment that, but for the grace of God, they would otherwise not be able to make it. And but for the Spirit of God, but for the teachings of Christ, but for Christ as the head of our church, none of us would be empowered or even capable of accomplishing what only the grace of God can do. So I'm not saying I'm a father according to the New Testament because I just merely chose to do that. I'm saying He favored me to do that. And when I committed to this life of following Christ and I learned what the Bible said about a new covenant marriage, it's very unique. So whether you are of a theistic tradition, Judaic, Islamic, Catholic, occultic, New Age, or denominational, whatever all that is, marriages are different according to culture, according to all types of things. But I'm speaking of a new covenant marriage inside a new covenant church that gives Christ the glory in that church, in that particular place, and also encourages others and doesn't cause people to shipwreck their faith. And it won't find a child, whichever side of the sexual identity crisis he's on, which shouldn't exist. No one's prepared for that. Even people or scholars like Hal Mohler is saying some very inept things about marriage. Even a pastor who writes about it totally contradicts the New Testament when he says he's a heterosexual Christian. So let's not be too hard on the children. If the parents, if the fathers, if the patriarchs, if the scholars, if the teachers bumble this terribly, the Bible knows of nothing of these abstract concepts according to which people are being unfortunately fashioned, and they're losing their lives over. So you have a blessed day, and please respond any way you want to with this, with hostility, with vitriol, with condemnation, with ridicule, with admiration, with questions. What difference would it make to me? I am now in my 36th year of marriage to the only woman I've ever dated. I'm a pastor of the only church I've ever joined, and I'm still holding fast my profession of faith conferred through baptism, and I'm still fellowshipping in the gospel. And all this is by the grace of God, and because He is here leading and guiding us, and me as overseer, pastor, He counts me faithful, putting me in this work and service, and I'm honored to serve God with my mind. I'm honored to be rather transformed by the renovation of my mind rather than be taken away and swept away. And for pastors out there who don't bother to study much, they don't serve God with their mind much, and for pastors who have silly answers like saying their orientation isn't sinful, or saying sexual identity has some function or value in our culture, just know that when outwardly that's what they say, then you know inwardly there's a problem. Jesus noticed that there were people who were like whited sepulchres. They would really be clean and polished on the outside, but inside they're just dead men's bones. So the best answer you get from a pastor, a Christian pastor, is some sexual identity that he uses to augment his own identity as a Christian. Or the best you get is some kind of explanation of the irrationale of sexual identity or orientation. Then know that you're probably dealing with some people who have some dark issues, and they need to come out of the darkness, come to the light, and allow their works to be exposed, and repent and believe on the Lord Jesus Christ. They need to pastor a New Testament church. They need to teach the doctrine of marriage. They need to teach people who intend to marry that they will be responsible for bringing a child into the world. If that's what God does, bless them with a child. And yes, the new covenant marriage has that responsibility in it, and that child to be raised in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, and be protected and guarded and sanctified in that marriage, in that church, in that hedge of blessing and grace and favor. So if you have something better than abstinence or a new covenant marriage, it's outside of the Bible, and God help you. And when you're exploited and used, and you use other people and exploit them, it'll catch up with you eventually, and you'll be broken and sad, and on the outside you can clean it up, but on the inside you'll always be just dead and without life, and you won't know what it is to live apart from all that. So you have a blessed day, and please respond in any way you feel necessary. And if it gets too ugly, I can just disable comments, but I'll be okay. So you have a blessed day.